Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hey there, my name is Kyle Hilliard. I'm gonna pause here because I gotta think of my exact title. Magazine content director at Game Informer magazine, GameInformer.com. I also co-host at MinMax with Ben Hansen and others. And my history is I was at Game Informer. I've been at Game Informer for a long time. I spent some time at GameSpot. I even worked for a game publisher for a little while. I've been poking around for the last decade or so, and Matt graciously invited me to come on the what is this? I guess you would call this a spin-off of the Fun and Games podcast, right? Side quests to talk about a video game I love. And I took him up on it immediately, and I got back to him right away with this recording, and he didn't have to follow up with me multiple times. This is all inside baseball, behind the scenes stuff. But Matt was very patient with me. It took me far too long to record this. Sorry, Matt. But here you go. I looked at the list of games that folks have talked about, and miraculously, no one has talked about The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, which is my sort of go-to answer for favorite game of all time. Folks will say, like, my favorite game changes, every year, every month, every week, every day, every hour, whatever. And I think that's a fair thing to say. I think that's true of me. My sort of list of favorite games of all time will obviously shift and move, and things will change, and I'll be more into this kind of game than this kind of game on different days. But I can confidently say that Ocarina of Time is my favorite game of all time, and I think it's locked into that position forever. So I'll always kind of go to it, even though maybe I had sort of maybe I look at Breath of the Wild as the game that I would immediately recommend to anybody today. It's like, if you want to see the apex of contemporary video games, you should check out The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But personally, to me, Ocarina of Time truly set me on this trajectory of recognizing video games as being these things that represent artistic expression. I loved video games from a young age. I started with Super Nintendo and Donkey Kong Country, and those are the first video games that we owned, that me and my brother played in our home. But I would play video games at friends' house. I always loved going to arcades. But really, those were always sort of given to me as challenges, right? Like Yoshi's Island, Donkey Kong Country, Mega Man X. Those games were all about overcoming challenges and levels and things like that. And I still love those experiences, and I still seek out those experiences. But The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was the first time I felt like I was visiting an alternate world, even more so than, say, reading a book or watching a movie or watching a television show. I just felt like my time spent in Ocarina of Time, like I had exited the earth and entered a new place. And it felt real. It felt like a real place. And the fact that I had the agency to kind of pursue things in whatever order I wanted to pursue was good. That gave me such a more ownership over that version of Hyrule. But my entrance to playing the game was odd. I never played Zelda on Super Nintendo or NES. Ocarina of Time was my first Zelda game. And I think for a lot of people who play their first Zelda game and they fall in love with Zelda, that ends up being a very important game to them. I think that's the case for a lot of folks. But I'd always heard it was good, but I always liked Mario because it was just more action focused and you could jump, and I never really loved the overhead perspective when I would dabble with the NES version. I just found it too challenging when I was young. But I visited a friend who had this huge library of N64 games. I'm sure we all had that friend. I grew up and maybe I got one or two games a year, and I loved them and I was grateful for them. But then you go to a friend's house who got maybe a game a month. And he had everything, and he had Ocarina of Time, which I'd heard of. I was aware of Zelda, but I was like, what is this Zelda thing that everyone talks about? Why is this such a popular game? Why do people like this game so much? And he was like, oh yeah, well, check it out. And he actually had finished the game. And so what he did, which is in retrospect kind of an odd thing, I feel like you wouldn't do that in this age, but in that era, which I guess was about 98 or 99, I wasn't as concerned with spoilers. Spoilers weren't really a thing. You were lucky to experience any sort of narrative fiction. So, like I didn't mind seeing what happened. And so what he did, what I'm getting at is he just played the end boss of the game. I just watched him beat Ganondorf. Like he showed me how to play, right? He's like, yeah, I usually put on these boots that let me walk on the air, and then what you have to do is you have to bat the energy balls back at him. And he played out the whole sequence. I saw the end before I saw anything else in Ocarina of Time. I saw the end, and I was so sort of enamored by it. And I was like, there's a narrative here, there's intensity, there's emotion, there's like cool action. The game looks amazing. All those things sort of made me just really become very interested in what was happening in that world. And so that following Christmas, I believe, or maybe birthday, I'm a Christmas baby. My birthday is just a few days before Christmas, so they all kind of coalesce and are the same thing basically. I got a copy of Ocarina of Time, and I spent a month on it. I remember sort of like it. I remember it really. I tracking it and seeing how much progress I made. And I had a save file, and my brother had a save file, and we're both kind of going at the same pace, and also not really telling each other what we were doing, if that makes sense. Like if I solved a puzzle or something, I wouldn't be like, hey, I solved this puzzle, this is how you do it, and vice versa. We were both kind of going on our own trajectory, but still discussing the game a lot. And I was really loving it. It was like one of the first games that I was playing that I could like walk up and talk to people, and not every instance of a person in the game was like a threat. Like in Mega Man X, for example, just as an odd point of comparison to a completely different game, everything in that game is out to get you and kill you and attack you. And that was the nature of most games. But in Ocarina of Time, and to be clear, Ocarina of Time was not so far from the first game to do this. This was a common thing in RPGs, and I just wasn't playing a lot of RPGs at the time. But the fact that I could go up to people in the world and talk to them, and they had a personality and characteristics and their own story to tell, was really enthralling and interesting. And I just hadn't had that experience in a video game yet. I know other people had, but I had not. And it all came to a head where, because I didn't know the structure of the game. I didn't know this is how Zelda worked, really, where it's like you have maybe a short story, so to speak. Like you beat the first 3 dungeons and you feel like you're heading towards a conclusion, and then surprise, you're not. There's actually a lot more. I didn't know that that's how the game worked at the time. And these days I get sort of frustrated by it because I'm an old man who doesn't have a lot of time to play video games, and I'm just like, I just wanted to get to the end. I don't want a whole other video game here. But at that time, when I was young and had all the time in the world, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much more going on in this world. But if you don't know the structure of Ocarina of Time, you play the first 3 dungeons, and you kind of think you're heading towards a conclusion, as I've teased, and then it turns out you've just scratched the surface. That's when the game really begins, and there's many dungeons after that. There's 7 dungeons after that. But there's this sequence after you finish the 3rd dungeon and you go to the Temple of Time, and then you sleep for 7 years. Like that's the narrative of the story. You sleep for 7 years, you wake up and everything's wrong. And there's this cutscene that explains how the world works and like what happened and why you slept for 7 years. And I remember, this is maybe an odd thing to say, but in the context of the game, I pulled the sword out. I was an adult. I got this cutscene that sort of explained what was going on, and I was so overwhelmed by what was happening in the fiction that I slowly walked out of the Temple of Time because I just couldn't take it all in at that moment. It was just too much to handle, and I just felt like I was literally, and I truly mean literally, in a sacred place. So I didn't want to hit the walls with my sword or do that thing where I roll. In the Ocarina of Time, you roll everywhere because it's faster. And I felt like I was really there, and I had really encountered this holy place. Like I had this sort of spiritual epiphany in the middle of Ocarina of Time. And it changed the way I think about video games forever. And it's the reason that I wanted to write about video games and be a part of the video game industry in a way, because that game was just so effective at delivering this magical fiction to me. I just loved it. And truly every video game I play today is chasing that feeling that I had that first time I slept for 7 years in the Temple of Light in Ocarina of Time. Gosh, now I'm second guessing if it's even called the Temple of Light. It might be called the Temple of Time, I think. But I swear to God, it really affected me in a big way. But yeah, I mean, and then the rest of the game is fantastic. The music is fantastic. The puzzles are fantastic. The visuals are fantastic. Everything about that game is just so beautiful and charming. And then that's why I think it will always just be my go-to answer for favorite game of all time. Because of time and place and the age I was and it being my first Zelda experience and all of those things, nothing will ever unseat that experience for me because it's so specific and nostalgic, and I was the right age to be playing that game. I've played games that feel and sound and look and play better and have better stories, but none of them will ever affect me in the same way as I did as a young kid playing Ocarina of Time, and I just have to come to terms with that. That's what you do when you get old. You have to come to terms with the fact that those kinds of experiences you have as a child won't exist anymore, and you just hope then you have kids and hope that you can witness their version of that. Not to sort of derail this monologue into a whole other experience. But anyway, hey, Ocarina of Time. What a fantastic game. I am hesitant to even recommend it to, a young player who sees it on the Switch Online store. It's not going to be the same for you as it was for me. But maybe you can play it and sort of understand it, at least. That's my hope for it. Happy gaming.
Video games are a unique medium.
They can tell stories,
Immerse us in strange, fantastic worlds.
blur the very boundaries of our reality.
But at the end of the day, video games are fun. Whatever fun is to you.
I'm Jeff Moonen,
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
and on Fun and Games, we talk about the history, trends, and community of video games.
It's a celebration of all the games we play and all the fun we find within them.
And there's so many more games out there, so we hope you'll share in that conversation with us.
Fun and Games podcast with Matt and Jeff. Find us on certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
And happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.